Around 70,000 men were killed or injured on the first day of the battle. More than 57,000 of them were from Britain and the Commonwealth. The full scale of the carnage didn't hit home with Geoffrey Malins until he found himself filming a roll call in the trenches after the first disastrous attacks. He described what he saw in his memoirs.
In one little space there were just 2 thin lines, all that was left of a glorious regiment. The ghastly scenes of which I was witness will always remain a hideous nightmare in my memory.
A few weeks later, those scenes were being shown to a military intelligence committee in London. There was debate over the content, but in the end, Malins and his producer convinced the government that the film was worth more than a series of short newsreel items.
According to the supervisory editor, he's the most important man putting this film together after cameraman. When he saw the power of this material, when it first comes back to London, when Malins and McDowell bring about 8,000 feet of this footage, he then persuades the War Office, no, this is great stuff. Let's turn it into a feature-length film.
Geoffrey Malins and his colleague had produced extraordinary footage, but some was not what it appeared to be.
The initial problem is that the film needed a climax, and the climax had to be the moment when the big push happened, when the troops go over the top. Now, Malins did film that, and the film that he took survives in the finished product. It's extremely small figures doing very unclear things in the extreme distance, and as a visual climax to a film, it's absolutely useless. So you can understand the impulse that would say, we've got to have something better.
Unable to capture that key moment, Malins had staged it behind the lines.
This piece of film really sums up everybody's view of the opening seconds of the Battle of the Somme. It's not on the Somme, it's not on the 1st of July, they're not even really soldiers taking part in the battle. There's the officer going forward, then everybody falls. That man looks back at the camera, then he falls back. And in the next sequence, that man falls, that man moves, having been shot apparently, and this man looks at the camera, crosses his legs.
But the majority of the film was all too real. In the months following its release, over 20 million people went to see it, half of the UK population. The government believed the film would convince audiences to stand behind the war effort, but its no-holds-barred approach was more than some people could take.
People are very shocked by what they see. One account is that people cry out at the famous over-the-top sequence, "Oh my God, he's been shot."
The general consensus was that if the purpose of the film was to expose the civilians on the home front to the realities of life on the Western Front, then death was one of those realities.
Above all, Malins and his colleagues had tried to show the humanity of life at the front. In picture houses all over Britain, families searched the faces for a glimpse of someone they knew or loved.
Now there he is, there. That's my dad, Walter. And there he is again. He spotted himself walking along a trench carrying a stretcher. And he called out in surprise, "That's me."
David Lidamore's father recognised himself in this shot 50 years later.
Seeing that picture of those men going through that trench, I feel what he must have felt like in the war when some of his mates must have been hit by shells and bombs and buried alive in mud and trenches. Now that's what I feel.
Geoffrey Malins' experiences on the Western Front took their toll. Ill health forced him home before the war ended. He'd risked his own life on countless occasions to get the shots he needed.
I have tried all the time to realise I was the eyes and ears of millions. In my pictures I have tried to catch something of the glamour as well as the awful horror of it all, worthy of being preserved as a permanent memorial of the greatest drama in history.
They really captured the spirit of the soldiers, and for me it was more about what the audiences would have felt at home. Like with 20 million seeing it, you can guarantee that if you're in the audience, there's either someone you know in that film or someone that you know of.
What I liked about it the most was that it was very honest and unscripted and very real, and I found it very moving.
I thought it was pitiful seeing everyone streaming to their death. That's what I thought was awful.
We know when we're looking at those faces that some of those people weren't going to survive the day, and that hits you hard as well.
It does, really.
Every time the camera's on the men, they're all looking at the camera, and through that I felt they're watching us. And what would they make of us 100 years later? And I had a sense of what's changed.
When I look at the film now, what I find remarkable is every time I see the film, I see something new. If ever one has a debate about the depiction of the horrors of war, which incidentally are still not really covered on British screens, this is the place where we start this discussion. Journalistic truth, the horrors of war, how does one represent the dead? How does one represent battle? It's all in the Battle of Somme. It's so relevant to us today.
Rowena Ciavanes feels that connection with the past more than most. She shares her great-grandfather's love of art and storytelling, and to commemorate this centenary, she's preparing an exhibition based around the man and his film.
He would be happy that he's inspiring younger generations, and I think with the fuss that's going on this year for the anniversary, I think he would feel that it should be made a fuss of, because maybe not necessarily his work, but what happened and the fact that he was able to go out there and film and that they were able to document is a really significant thing. It's not live-in memory at all for me anymore. It's still close memory, and I think it's really important that that's not lost.
During this centenary year, Geoffrey Maylin's film will be shown here in the UK and overseas. It's clear that despite the passage of time, it still has a resonance for today's audiences. Of course, the greater story remains the tragedy of the First World War and the Battle of the Somme in particular. But Geoffrey Maylin's personality, his energy and his undoubted courage have combined to earn him a place in this chapter of our history.